What if everything you believed about success was a lie? We're taught that once you reach the top, life gets easier. That money, power, and status are the ultimate proof that you've made it. But what if the very thing you thought was a reward was actually a trap? Malcolm Hayes had it all: wealth, influence, a name that commanded respect. He built his empire from nothing, turning struggle into triumph. But one night he walked into his multi-million-dollar penthouse and saw something that shattered everything he believed. His father, the man who raised him, the man he worked his entire life to provide for, was on his knees scrubbing the floor. Why? Why would a man who had everything still choose to work like he had nothing? What happened next changed Malcolm forever, and by the end of this story, it might just change you too. The city of Crestford pulsed with life, its skyline a jagged silhouette against the storm-heavy sky. Sheets of rain lashed against the towering glass structures, their reflections flickering like ghosts in the puddles below. The streets, always restless, were a symphony of honking horns, hurried footsteps, and the occasional shout of street vendors, still hoping to make a last sale before the downpour drove everyone inside. From the penthouse office of Hayes Global Enterprises, Malcolm Hayes stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a crystal glass of whiskey in his hand. The golden liquid swirled lazily as he took a slow sip, his gaze locked on the world below, a world he had conquered. His name was printed on buildings, whispered in boardrooms, and respected in circles that once would have never let a man like him in. He had built an empire with nothing but ambition, sleepless nights, and an unshakable belief that he was destined for more. Yet, as the rain pounded against the glass, an unease settled deep in his chest. "Mr. Hayes?" A soft voice broke the silence. His assistant, Victoria, stood near the doorway, her usual poised demeanor slightly hesitant. "What is it?" Malcolm's voice was smooth, controlled, a tone honed through years of commanding rooms filled with powerful men. "Your car is ready," she said, shifting slightly on her heels. "Will you be heading straight home?" Malcolm exhaled, rolling his shoulders back as if shaking off the strange weight pressing against him. "Yeah," he muttered, setting the glass down with a soft clink. "Send a message to Parker. I want the Tokyo numbers on my desk first thing in the morning." "Of course," Victoria nodded, watching as he grabbed his coat and strode past her, his usual confidence in every step. But she noticed something different tonight, a flicker of something in his eyes. Doubt? Maybe it was just the storm. The black luxury sedan glided through the streets, raindrops streaking across the tinted windows. Malcolm leaned back against the leather seat, the dim city lights flashing across his face as they passed through the neon glow of Crestford's financial district. His driver, an older man named Eugene who had been with him for years, remained silent. He knew better than to interrupt Malcolm's thoughts. Malcolm closed his eyes, but rest wouldn't come. His mind raced through stock prices, acquisition deals, board meetings, all the things that made up his world. But beneath that, something gnawed at him, an itch he couldn't scratch. The car pulled up to his building, a sleek high-rise that screamed exclusivity. He stepped out, nodding at the doorman before heading straight for the elevator. The moment the doors closed, he exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. By the time he reached his penthouse floor, his mask of composure was firmly back in place. The doors slid open, revealing the immaculate space he called home. Dark marble floors, plush furniture, a skyline view that could make anyone feel invincible. But something was off. A faint sound, the rhythmic swish of fabric against tile, the scent of cleaning solution mixing with the usual faint aroma of leather and aged whiskey. Malcolm's steps slowed as he turned the corner into the grand living area, then stopped cold. There, on his knees, scrubbing the pristine marble floor with a worn-out rag, was his father. Benjamin Hayes, the man who had raised him with calloused hands and quiet wisdom, now hunched over, his strong aging fingers working against the spotless surface, his graying hair curled slightly at the ends, damp with sweat. His broad shoulders, once the foundation of Malcolm's world, now seemed smaller, weighed down by something unseen. For a moment, Malcolm could do nothing but stare. The scene before him felt surreal, like a nightmare stitched into reality. His throat tightened, anger and confusion clashing in his chest like an electric storm. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a whip. Benjamin barely looked up, his deep brown eyes calm, steady, just as they had always been. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, then resumed his work. Cleaning. The simplicity of the answer only fueled the fire in Malcolm's veins. His fists clenched at his sides as he took a step closer. "Why?" he demanded. "You don't have to do this. I have people for this. Why are you on the damn floor like what?" Benjamin interrupted finally, meeting his son's gaze. His voice was gentle, but there was something in it, something unshakable. Malcolm swallowed, his jaw tightening, like some kind of worker. Benjamin smiled then, a small knowing smile that only deepened Malcolm's frustration. "Because I am one." The words landed like a punch to Malcolm's gut. He shook his head, exhaling sharply. "No, Dad. You don't have to work anymore. I made sure of that. You have everything you need. You don't have to lift a damn finger for the rest of your life." Benjamin leaned back on his heels, resting his forearm on his knee. He studied Malcolm for a long moment, as if searching for something in his son's face. "You think work is just about money?" he asked finally. Malcolm blinked. "What else would it be about?" Benjamin chuckled, shaking his head. "Lord, have mercy. I failed you somewhere, didn't I?" The words made something inside Malcolm flinch, though he didn't know why. His father sighed, pushing himself up to stand. Even in his old age, there was a strength in the way he moved, a quiet dignity that made Malcolm feel suddenly small. "Come sit," Benjamin gestured toward the couch. Malcolm hesitated. His whole body was still stiff with frustration, but there was something in his father's gaze that made it impossible to say no. With a deep breath, he followed, sinking onto the couch across from the man who had shaped him. The storm outside raged on, lightning casting sharp shadows against the walls. But inside, an even greater storm was brewing between father and son, one that would change Malcolm's life forever. The storm outside raged on, its fury mirrored in the quiet but palpable tension inside Malcolm Hayes's penthouse. The high-rise windows trembled as the wind howled, and rain streaked across the glass like frantic brushstrokes against the night. Yet, the chaos of the city outside was nothing compared to the turmoil building within him. Malcolm sat stiffly on the leather couch, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers laced tightly together. His father, Benjamin Hayes, sat across from him, casual, unbothered, as if he had every right to be here, as if nothing about this situation was strange. But it was strange. It was wrong. His father, was cleaning his floors. Malcolm's mind still struggled to make sense of what he had walked into. Benjamin had always been a man of principle, a man who had worked hard his entire life, but Malcolm had changed that. He had built an empire to ensure that his father would never have to struggle again. And yet, there he was, on his knees, scrubbing the floor like he had no place in this house other than as a worker. Malcolm exhaled slowly, trying to keep his frustration in check. He prided himself on his ability to remain composed, negotiation tables, boardroom debates, even hostile takeovers. Nothing rattled him. But this was different. "This isn't necessary, Dad," Malcolm said, his voice measured but tight. "Why are you doing this?" Benjamin leaned back against the couch, stretching his legs out like he had all the time in the world. His hands, rough and worn from years of labor, rested easily on his knees. There was no hint of shame in his expression, no regret, just that quiet wisdom Malcolm had grown up with. "Because the floor was dirty," Benjamin said simply. Malcolm closed his eyes for half a second, pressing his fingers against his temple. He should have expected that answer. His father had always been infuriatingly straightforward. "I have staff for that," Malcolm said, trying again. "People who are paid to do it. I wasn't looking to get paid. That's not the point." Malcolm leaned forward, his voice dipping lower. "You shouldn't be doing this. You don't have to do this." Benjamin tilted his head slightly, considering his son. "Is that what bothers you?" he asked, his voice even. "That I don't have to?" Malcolm frowned. "Of course that's what bothers me." Benjamin chuckled, shaking his head. "No, son. What's bothering you is that you came home expecting to see your father, in comfort, maybe reading a book, sipping on some of that expensive tea you keep in the cabinet. Instead, you saw me on my knees, working, and that made you uncomfortable." Malcolm's jaw clenched. Benjamin leaned forward now, resting his elbows on his knees. "Tell me something, Malcolm. Do you think work is beneath me?" Malcolm exhaled sharply. "That's not what I'm saying." "But you think it, don't you?" Benjamin pressed. His voice was calm, but there was something behind it. Something Malcolm recognized from his childhood. His father was teaching him a lesson. Malcolm stood abruptly, running a hand over his face. He turned toward the window, the city stretching out beneath him, endless and vast. The lights below blinked like stars, tiny compared to the height of his success. "I just don't understand," Malcolm muttered. "I worked my whole life to make sure you never had to struggle again. And you—" He turned back toward his father, gesturing to the bucket, the rag. I choose to do this," Benjamin nodded. "I do." "Why?" Malcolm demanded. "You have everything. Anything you want, I can give you. I have given you. Why would you—" "Because I'm not you, Malcolm." The words stopped Malcolm cold. Benjamin's gaze was steady, unwavering. "You built your life around never having to work the way I did, and I respect that. But I built my life around something different. Work isn't a punishment to me. It's not about struggle. It's about purpose." Malcolm's chest tightened. "You don't need a purpose anymore, Dad." Benjamin smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Son, purpose isn't something you retire from." The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Malcolm wanted to argue. He wanted to tell his father that he had earned the right to rest, that no one would ever see him as anything less if he simply allowed himself to enjoy the life Malcolm had built for him. But as he looked into his father's eyes, he saw something deeper. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about success. It wasn't even about work. This was about identity. Benjamin Hayes wasn't a man who measured his worth by comfort. He had spent decades working with his hands, building things, fixing things, providing for his family in the only way he knew how. And now his son, a man who had built his world on wealth and power, was telling him that all of that had no value. Malcolm sat back down, running a hand over his jaw. The storm outside had quieted, the rain now a soft hum against the windows. "I don't get it," Malcolm admitted, his voice quieter now. "I really don't." Benjamin smiled again, softer this time. "That's all right," he said. "You will." Malcolm didn't know why, but those words sent a chill down his spine. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, soft patters against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Malcolm Hayes' penthouse. The storm outside had quieted, but inside, the air remained thick with unspoken words. Malcolm sat on the couch, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming restlessly against his knee. His father, Benjamin Hayes, sat across from him, relaxed, completely unfazed, like a man who had nothing to prove. It was infuriating. Malcolm had spent his entire life trying to give his father more than the backbreaking labor, more than the sleepless nights, more than the exhaustion of stretching every dollar just to make ends meet. He had built an empire so that his father would never have to lift another finger. And yet, there he was, cleaning floors, in his home. Benjamin, on the other hand, seemed completely at peace. He leaned back into the couch, his rough hands resting on his thighs, his expression unreadable. "So, let me get this straight," Malcolm said finally, his voice measured, though frustration still laced every word. "You choose to do this?" Benjamin exhaled slowly. "That's right." "Why?" Malcolm pressed, his eyes locked onto his father's, searching for something, anything that would make this make sense. "You don't have to work anymore. I made sure of that. You've earned the right to rest." Benjamin smiled, that same knowing, infuriatingly calm smile. "Rest from what, son?" "From work," Malcolm snapped, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. "From having to scrub floors, from having to—" He gestured vaguely, his voice rising with frustration. "This—" Benjamin tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "And you think work is something a man needs to be freed from?" Malcolm blinked, his breath hitching slightly at the weight of the question. He didn't know why, but something about it made him uncomfortable. "You worked so hard your whole life," Malcolm argued, shaking his head. "I watched you. I saw how exhausted you were, how much you sacrificed. I built all of this so that you wouldn't have to anymore. And now you're telling me you want to be on your hands and knees cleaning floors?" Benjamin chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I never worked because I had to, Malcolm. I worked because it gave me purpose." Malcolm's frustration flared again. "Purpose? Dad, you don't need to work for purpose. You could travel, relax, do things you actually enjoy instead of—" "Instead of what?" Benjamin interrupted, his voice a calm but firm. "Instead of doing something useful?" Malcolm opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Benjamin leaned forward now, resting his elbows on his knees. "Let me ask you something, son. If I stopped working, if I sat around all day doing nothing, if I let others do everything for me, who would I be?" Malcolm frowned. "You'd still be my father. You'd still be you." Benjamin nodded slowly. "And who is that?" The question hit Malcolm in a way he wasn't prepared for. For years he had seen his father as the man who sacrificed, the man who worked multiple jobs, who came home with grease-stained hands, who fell asleep in a worn-out chair but still woke up before dawn to do it all over again. He had built himself from the ground up, not with money but with sheer grit. But now, looking at the man before him, Malcolm realized his father had never seen that as a burden. He had seen it as an honor. Benjamin exhaled, his gaze steady. "You think money changes who a man is, Malcolm?" Malcolm hesitated. "I think it can." His father nodded. "It can, but it doesn't have to." He leaned back, tapping his fingers against the couch's armrest. "I spent my whole life working with my hands, building things, fixing things. I take pride in that. I don't do it because I have to. I do it because it's who I am." Malcolm clenched his jaw. "But I worked so that you wouldn't have to be that man anymore." Benjamin's expression softened. "And what if I never wanted to stop being that man?" The silence that followed was thick, heavy. Malcolm looked away, running a hand over his face. This wasn't how he thought this conversation would go. He had expected his father to understand, to see the luxury around him, the success, and finally allow himself to enjoy it without feeling the need to do something. But instead, Malcolm was the one struggling to understand. Benjamin let out a small sigh, standing up and stretching his arms over his head. "You've done well for yourself, son," he said after a moment. "I'm proud of you." Malcolm swallowed hard. "But?" His father chuckled, shaking his head. "No but, just proud." The words settled in Malcolm's chest, heavy and warm. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard them so plainly. Benjamin walked over to the cleaning supplies, picking up the rag he had been using earlier. He turned back to Malcolm, amusement dancing in his eyes. "Don't worry, I won't be cleaning your floors again." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Promise?" Benjamin smirked. "No." Malcolm let out a breath that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "You're impossible, you know that?" Benjamin clapped him on the shoulder as he passed. "And you're still learning." Malcolm watched as his father walked toward the hallway, disappearing into the guest room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Outside, the rain had stopped, but inside Malcolm's mind, a storm still raged. The night stretched long after Benjamin disappeared down the hall, leaving Malcolm alone with a mind full of questions he wasn't ready to answer. The city outside had settled into a quiet hum, the storm now reduced to the occasional distant rumble. Yet inside Malcolm's chest, the thunder still rolled. He leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts circling like a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. He had spent his life believing that success was measured in the weight of one's wallet, in the number of buildings bearing his name, in the power to walk into any room and command attention. But tonight, for the first time in years, Malcolm felt small. His father had everything. A life free from struggle, a home he didn't have to clean, money he would never run out of. But instead of embracing it, he chose to kneel on the floor and scrub like nothing had changed. Like nothing Malcolm had built mattered. Malcolm exhaled sharply, shaking his head. It wasn't just confusion gnawing at him, it was something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to hurt. He pushed himself off the couch, his frustration bubbling over. He wasn't going to spend the night trapped in his own mind. With long, purposeful strides, he walked down the hallway and knocked firmly on the guest room door. No answer. "Dad?" Malcolm called out. Still nothing. Malcolm sighed, pushing the door open. Benjamin sat on the edge of the bed, legs apart, hands clasped. Together, staring out the window as if the skyline held answers to questions Malcolm didn't even know how to ask. The soft glow of the city lights reflected against his dark skin, deepening the lines on his face, each one a mark of years well lived. Malcolm stepped inside. "You awake?" Benjamin smirked. "If I wasn't, I am now." Malcolm crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "We need to talk." Benjamin stretched his back, letting out a small grunt before looking up. "That right?" Malcolm nodded, his expression serious. "All right, son." Benjamin patted the space next to him on the bed. "Talk." Malcolm hesitated for a moment before walking over, sitting beside his father, mirroring his posture. Elbows on his knees, hands clasped, eyes staring ahead. The silence stretched between them. Malcolm exhaled slowly. "I don't get it, Dad." Benjamin turned his head slightly. "Don't get what?" "This." Malcolm gestured vaguely, trying to grasp the words that felt just out of reach. "The way you see things, the way you live. You worked hard your whole life, sacrificed everything for me. And now, when you finally have the chance to rest, you're still working, still choosing to work. Why?" Benjamin chuckled, shaking his head. "You think rest means doing nothing?" Malcolm frowned. "Doesn't it?" His father exhaled, rubbing his palms together before turning fully toward him. "Son, you worked your whole life to make sure you never had to struggle the way I did. And I respect that. But let me ask you something. Are you happy?" Malcolm blinked. What? Are you happy, Malcolm? Benjamin repeated, his voice gentle but firm. With all your money, your power, your big office on the top floor, do you ever wake up in the morning and feel happy? Malcolm opened his mouth, but no words came out. He wanted to say yes, wanted to say that waking up in luxury, knowing he had the world at his fingertips, was enough. But the truth sat heavy on his tongue. Benjamin nodded knowingly. That's what I thought. Malcolm clenched his jaw. Dad, just because I don't go around scrubbing floors doesn't mean I'm unhappy. I never said it did. Then what are you saying? I'm saying that a man without purpose is just a rich man with an expensive bed and no reason to get out of it. Malcolm exhaled sharply. I have purpose. Benjamin raised an eyebrow. Do you? Malcolm turned toward him, his frustration rising again. Of course I do. I run one of the biggest corporations in the country. I employ thousands of people. I've built everything from nothing. You think that's not purpose? Benjamin studied him carefully. It's success, but is it purpose? Malcolm scoffed, shaking his head. Dad, not everyone finds meaning in cleaning floors and fixing things with their hands. Some of us are meant for bigger things. Benjamin let out a deep breath, nodding slowly. And you think what I do is small? Malcolm hesitated. He hadn't meant to say it like that, but Benjamin smiled, but there was something behind it, something sad. Let me tell you a story. Malcolm sighed. Dad, just listen. Malcolm closed his mouth, leaning back slightly. Benjamin's gaze drifted past the window as he spoke. When you were a boy, we lived in that little apartment over on Rosewood. You remember? Malcolm nodded slowly. He remembered the cramped space, the leaky ceiling, the way the heat barely worked in the winter. You were about 7. Benjamin continued. One day I came home from work and you were sitting at the table struggling with your homework. You were frustrated, ready to give up. And I sat down next to you, took your pencil and showed you how to solve the problem. Do you remember what you said to me? Malcolm's brow furrowed, digging through faded memories. He shook his head. Benjamin smiled. You're so smart, Dad. You should be a teacher. Malcolm let out a small breath of amusement. I don't remember that. I do. Benjamin's voice was quieter now, because that was the first time I realized something. I never had the luxury of a fancy degree. I wasn't a businessman or a scholar or a politician, but I was teaching you. In my own way, through my work, through my hands, through the way I carried myself. He met Malcolm's gaze, and that was enough for me. Malcolm swallowed hard. I don't need money to tell me I have value, Benjamin continued. I don't need power to know my worth. I worked hard, son, but I lived hard too, and I never forgot who I was along the way. Malcolm exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. His father's words dug deep, unearthing things he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Benjamin patted his knee and stood. I'm going to bed, he said, stretching his arms with a small grunt. You should get some rest too. Malcolm watched as his father made his way to the door, pausing briefly before stepping out. And Malcolm? Malcolm looked up. You built a life most men would envy, but don't forget to live in it. Then he was gone, leaving Malcolm alone in the quiet, the weight of his father's words pressing heavier than ever. The morning light crept through the penthouse windows, cutting through the remnants of night like a quiet revelation. Malcolm Hayes had barely slept. His father's words echoed in his mind, each syllable pressing against the walls of his thoughts, demanding space. Are you happy? A man without purpose is just a rich man with an expensive bed and no reason to get out of it. Malcolm sat at the edge of his bed, his elbows resting on his thighs, staring at the floor as if it held the answers. The world outside was already awake, the hum of the city rising like an unrelenting tide, but inside there was only stillness. He had spent his entire life proving that he was more than where he came from, that the struggling boy from Rosewood had transformed into someone who mattered, someone whose name carried weight in the highest circles. But last night, his father had made him question something he had never allowed himself to before. Was success enough? With a deep breath, Malcolm stood, stretching out the tension in his shoulders. He grabbed his phone, flicking through emails, messages, deals that needed closing, numbers that needed reviewing. But instead of responding, he set the phone back down. For the first time in years, he ignored the demands of his empire. He needed to see something. An hour later, Malcolm pulled into the parking lot of the Cresford Community Center. It was an old brick building, unassuming, with a fading mural on one side depicting a group of children playing. It was the kind of place that most people in his world never thought about, never needed to think about. But his father came here every week. Malcolm stepped out of his car, adjusting the cuff of his tailored shirt before heading toward the entrance. The moment he walked through the doors, the air shifted. It smelled of old books, fresh coffee, and floor wax. Nothing like the sterile, curated spaces he was used to. The sound of laughter echoed from the hallways, mixed with the rhythmic squeak of sneakers on a gym floor. A group of teenagers huddled near the front desk, their conversation stopping as they noticed him. He wasn't exactly dressed for this place. A woman behind the desk looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly before recognition dawned. "Malcolm Hayes," she said, her voice holding a mix of surprise and curiosity. Malcolm offered a tight smile. "I'm looking for Benjamin Hayes." Her expression softened. "He's in the back, with the boys." She gestured toward a hallway, and Malcolm nodded, making his way past faded posters about literacy programs and job fairs. When he reached the open door at the end of the hall, he stopped. Inside, his father stood in the middle of a workshop, surrounded by young men, late teens, early 20s, each one watching him intently as he demonstrated something with his hands. A wooden chair sat between them, half assembled, its frame held together with clamps. "You see this?" Benjamin said, tapping the frame. "You rush the process, you don't let the joints settle, and it all falls apart the moment you put weight on it. Life's the same way. You cut corners, you skip the hard parts, and sooner or later, you collapse." The boys nodded, some taking notes, others just absorbing his words. Malcolm felt something tighten in his chest. This wasn't just a hobby for his father. This was his purpose. "Dad," Malcolm said, stepping inside. Benjamin turned, his face lighting up with a mixture of surprise and something else, something Malcolm couldn't quite place. "Well, look who finally came down from his castle," Benjamin teased. The boys chuckled, and Malcolm forced a smirk. "Thought I'd see what all the fuss was about." Benjamin gestured toward the work table. "You ever built something with your hands, Malcolm?" Malcolm scoffed. "I build companies." "I said with your hands," Benjamin clarified, handing him a small wooden dowel. "Not with a pen." The boys watched as Malcolm hesitated before, taking the piece of wood, turning it in his fingers. It was smooth, solid. Benjamin pointed at the half-built chair. "You want to understand what I do? Help me finish this." Malcolm exhaled, loosening the buttons at his cuffs before rolling up his sleeves. He stepped forward, accepting the challenge. For the next hour, Malcolm followed his father's instructions. He sanded edges, measured joints, and fit pieces together, each movement foreign yet strangely grounding. The boys watched in fascination as Malcolm, the Malcolm Hayes, billionaire corporate giant, knelt beside his father, adjusting a wooden frame like an apprentice. At one point, Benjamin chuckled. "You're holding that all wrong." Malcolm frowned. "I don't see you correcting anyone else. They don't act like they already know everything, Benjamin shot back. The room erupted in laughter. Malcolm shook his head, but even he couldn't stop the small smile tugging at his lips. By the time they were finished, the chair stood upright, sturdy and whole. Benjamin patted it proudly. "Now that," he said, "is something worth sitting on." Malcolm wiped his hands on his slacks, staring at the finished product. He had closed million-dollar deals, made decisions that shaped entire industries, but standing there looking at the simple chair he had helped build, he felt something unexpected: satisfaction. Benjamin clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You see, son, it's not about what you build, it's about why you build it." Malcolm looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time he understood. His father hadn't refused luxury out of stubbornness. He hadn't kept working because he didn't appreciate what Malcolm had done for him. He had done it because this, guiding, teaching, creating, was what made him feel alive. Malcolm exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know," he said, "this might be the first time I've ever gotten my hands dirty." Benjamin grinned. "Then it's about time, son." As they stood there, surrounded by young men who saw Benjamin as more than just an old worker, as a mentor, a guide, Malcolm realized something. His father wasn't beneath him. He was above him, in ways Malcolm had never acknowledged before. And maybe, just maybe, Malcolm had spent his entire life climbing the wrong ladder. The city of Crestford buzzed as usual, horns blaring, feet scuffling against the pavement, conversations blending into the chaotic symphony of urban life. But for Malcolm Hayes, everything felt different. For years, he had moved through this city with the confidence of a king surveying his kingdom. His empire stretched across industries. His name carried weight in boardrooms filled with the most powerful people in the world. Yet as he sat in his sleek office, surrounded by walls of glass and steel, he found himself staring at his hands. Rough patches of dried glue still clung to his skin, remnants of the chair he had built with his father. The sensation was foreign, the evidence of manual labor clashing against everything he had built his life to avoid. But he hadn't washed it off. He didn't want to. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Mr. Hayes?" Victoria, his assistant, peeked in, her usual composed expression faltering when she saw him sitting there, uncharacteristically still. "Your meeting with the board starts in 10 minutes. Malcolm nodded but didn't move. Victoria hesitated. "Everything all right, sir?" He looked up at her, really looked at her. For years she had been by his side, anticipating his every move, ensuring his world ran flawlessly. He had never once asked her if she liked the work, if she felt fulfilled. He cleared his throat. "Victoria, are you happy?" Her brows furrowed. "Sir, are you happy? With this job, with what we do?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, caught off guard by the sudden question. I mean, I suppose so. It's a good position, good salary." Malcolm leaned back in his chair. "That's not what I asked." Victoria blinked, shifting on her feet. She was always composed, always efficient, but now, for the first time, she looked uncertain. "I don't know," she admitted softly. Malcolm nodded, the answer settling into him like a final piece of a puzzle. "Cancel the board meeting," he said, standing up. Victoria's eyes widened. "Sir, you can't..." "Cancel it," he repeated, already grabbing his coat, "and schedule a press conference instead. 2 hours. Victoria hesitated but nodded, picking up her phone as Malcolm walked out the door. The press conference room was packed. Reporters filled every chair, cameras lined the back wall, and the hum of curiosity buzzed through the air. Malcolm Hayes didn't call press conferences often. When he did, it meant something big. Stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone. The cameras flashed, the murmurs quieted. He took a breath. "For most of my life," he began, his voice steady but carrying something deeper, something raw. I believed success was measured in numbers, profits, expansion, the weight of my name in the corporate world. A pause. The room hung onto his words. But recently I've come to understand something that I never allowed myself to see before. Success, true success, isn't about what you take. It's about what you build. The reporters leaned in. Malcolm glanced at his hands, the faint traces of glue still there, before continuing. My father spent his life working with his hands. He built things, not for money, not for recognition, but because creating something solid, something real, meant something to him. And for years I thought I was better because I had outgrown that. He exhaled. I was wrong. Silence. The weight of his words settled over the room. Starting today, Malcolm said, his voice clear, unwavering, Hayes Global Enterprises is launching a new initiative, a permanent fund dedicated to providing education and vocational training for underprivileged youth, not just scholarships for elite universities, but real training, mentorship programs, apprenticeships, trade schools. We will invest not just in business, but in people. The room exploded in murmurs, pens scratching against notepads, fingers flying over keyboards. Malcolm held up a hand, signaling for silence. This company has spent years building wealth. Now we're going to build opportunity. A beat of silence, then the first clap, then another, and another, until the room erupted into applause. Malcolm stepped back from the podium, his chest rising and falling with something unfamiliar, relief, purpose. As he exited the room, his phone buzzed, a message from his father. I saw the press conference. You finally get it now, don't you? Malcolm smiled, typing back a simple reply, yeah, I do. And now I want to ask you, what does success really mean to you? Is it just about money, status, and power? Or is it about something deeper, something that lasts beyond numbers in a bank account? Malcolm spent his whole life chasing one version of success, only to realize that true greatness wasn't about what he built, but who he became in the process. So ask yourself, are you truly fulfilled, or are you just busy? Are you building a life that only looks successful from the outside, or one that actually means something when the cameras are off and the world stops watching? Drop a comment below. What was the biggest lesson you took from this story? How do you define success? Let's talk about it. And if this story made you think, if it challenged your perspective even just a little, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Because trust me, this is just the beginning. More powerful stories are coming, ones that will push you to question, grow, and redefine the way you see the world. Don't miss out. Hit subscribe, turn on those notifications, and I'll see you in the next one.